good evening to all. Namaste. Welcome from IIT Gandhinagar. We have today the second talk by Professor Srinivas Reddy in this course on India's landscape of literatures, pre-colonial largely, but sometimes, as you will see with the few speakers, we will extend all the way to the 20th century because, in fact, there is often no break in the continuity. So yesterday, Professor Srinivas Reddy gave us a kind of journey through the foundations of Telugu's classical literature. And today he is planning to focus more particularly on one text, which is the famous epic poem by Krishnadevaraya, Āmuktamālyada, on which, in fact, I should mention that Professor Srinivas Reddy translated and published the translation of this book several years ago. It was perhaps the first book by him that I read, and I remember reading it carefully, word for word, including every single note appending to the text. And it was just a delight, and I found it a revelation in many ways, revelation about Krishnadevaraya himself, about the content, and the whole literary context. I think this is enough of an introduction. And Srini, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Michelle. You're really kind, and I know you're so genuine because I know you read every single note and made comments about all of that. So I commend you for your, just attention to detail, which I've always been very impressed by, and it's always been a source of inspiration in my own scholarship to follow in that kind of, just precision of your scholarship and your attention to detail. I really appreciate that. And I thank you for organizing this course. As always, thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the team. Lovely to see all dear friends from IIT, which is always a home for me. And I look forward to coming back as soon as I can. Today, after yesterday's talk, which was very general about, you could say the birth of, literary Telugu and its relationship to, the rise of vernacular literatures throughout India and their, not to say opposition, but their relationship to the kind of great tradition, the Marga tradition of Sanskrit, and how that modality is constantly playing out and, coming to new formulations as time goes on. So let me start this presentation and share, I'm just going to share a lot of poems today because I think just to, people don't, if you don't read the literature, you don't realize how rich this stuff really is. It's, and the kind of imagination that goes into being a kavi of those times, and what it means to kind of reinvent some of these classical modalities over and over and again, and bring a certain kind of vitality and freshness to them, while at the same time remaining, you could argue, a very, traditional classical type of text. So that's something that this particular text does very well. And let me see if I can get this going. So here's of course, all know this image. This image you can still see today. It's right outside the Garbhagriha at Tirupati. So right actually before you enter the main area, the central area there, if you just look back, you'll see Krishnadevaraya standing there flanked by his two wives in this beautiful, kind of Anjali prayer position. And, there's a lot to discuss about this image and this bronze in general, but just to show that, Raya visited Tirupati 7 times. And this is well documented. And the main point I want to stress is this man was a very devout bhakta. You feel that when you read the poems. It comes out in his life history and the kinds of things that he did, to pilgrimages, donations to temple, et cetera, et cetera. But it really, viscerally comes out when you read his text. So that's the first important thing to remember, that he really was a devout, and particularly a Sri Vaishnava. And I know that there's been some debate about this issue, which particular sect of Vaishnava thought he was connected to, especially in regard to the different kinds of pundits that he had at his courts. And even his Rajaguru, was not ostensibly a Sri Vaishnava. But, I think a lot of that discussion or evidential kind of argumentation is not really the main issue, because, or maybe it is the main issue in the sense that it gives us a sense that you could have a teacher who might have been a disciple or a Madhva, a Dvaita school philosopher, and you could have a guru that was, a Vedantin, Advaita Vedantin, and you yourself could be a Sri Vaishnava. That this was not really an issue. And this goes even beyond Vaishnavism. There were plenty of Shaiva scholars that were also at Vijayanagara. So the kind of distinctions we make that become categorical, I think also get complicated when we really look at what's going on. So my argument about Krishnadevaraya's Sri Vaishnavism really comes from simply reading his text. And I think when you read the text, you can see that that's the tradition he's steeped in. That's the tradition he seems to have a deep personal connection to. So I think that's important. I'll get into this a little bit more, but the title of the talk is called Conquest of the World. And, that sounds pretty bold. Of course, he's a great king who did, conquer a lot of territory. But Conquest of the World is actually in reference to a great hall that was in Vijayanagara known as the Bhuvana Vijayam, which basically means conquering the world. But it was not a hall where warriors sat. It was a hall where poets sat. It was a literary hall. And this is another really important point I want to make, is that, literature in that time, it was the, media outlet of the time. There's no Facebooks, no this thing, no that thing, no TVs, no radio, nothing. But poets are the ones that spread the word of the king, the glory of the king. And in many ways, you get this theme repeated again and again in all of this literary tradition, is that the idea that poetry or word itself, and this is a very fundamental Indian idea, word itself is generative of the universe. That Shabda, and this goes way back to really early, philosophical ideas too, that word, the idea of a sound even, creates the entire world, creates the universe. This is a very powerful idea. And of course, then what crafted sound and crafted words like poetry, what they can do for, people, empires, kings, whatever, is even more powerful. So Conquest of the World is really to be taken not in a militaristic sense, but in a much more philosophical sense in its relation to the written / spoken word. So yeah, today I'll just talk about Krishnadevaraya's Āmuktamālyada. So, he was a great king, but he was also a great poet. And Āmuktamālyada is considered one of the Pancha Mahakavyas of Telugu. Again, here's a perfect example of, one literary tradition borrowing from another's kind of framework. This idea of Pancha Mahakavya, that's a Sanskrit idea. We have, the well-known kavyas of Sanskrit, Kalidasa and Sriharsha and all of that. But Telugu takes that formulation and then, says, oh yes, we also have Pancha Mahakavyas, but Telugu ones, and Āmuktamālyada is one of them. And what I will try to show today is how Āmuktamālyada is at one level a continuation of this kind of tradition that's been growing since, we learned Nannaya and all these other poets, Potana Srinatha, a continuation of that, a kind of, apex of that tradition, but also a very interesting and important departure from some earlier trends. So it functions in these two ways that are quite interesting. Okay, so the context of this poem is that Raya was out on his quest to conquer the Kalinga territory, against the Gajapati, and at one point he goes and he camps near this temple, the temple of Andhra Mahavishnu. And he actually sleeps inside the temple. This is what he relates inside Āmuktamālyada. And he has a dream. And in the dream, this Vishnu comes to him and basically says, you need to write something, and you need to write something in Telugu. Now, what's interesting here, and this relates to kind of the stuff that we talked about earlier, is that in order to be a Telugu poet, or a vernacular poet, you could say in general, of that time, a precursor to that is that you had to have mastered Sanskrit. And probably you not only mastered, but you would also have composed in that language already. So that's exactly what we hear in this verse. Now, this is again, Andhra Mahavishnu's words, spelling out the works in Sanskrit that Krishnadevaraya had already written. Means what? Means this is kind of like your qualifications. Like, okay, you're already a master of Sanskrit. Then he says, now it's time to do something in Telugu. So I'll just read out, what this verse says. You composed the story of Madhalasa and the pleasures of Satyabhama, and delighted connoisseurs with your natural usage of hyperbole, metaphor, subtle suggestion, and sarcasm. This is all reference to different kinds of Sanskrit alankaras, by the way. You selected the best episodes from the Vedas and the Puranas, and you compiled the abridged essence of all stories. With great poetic skill, you wrote the jewel of wisdom that could dispel the sins of any listener. And your handbook on aesthetics was praised by scholars for its sweet poetry. So what is really being said here is you are qualified. You know your Vedas, you know your Puranas, you know your Alankara Shastra, you know all of these things. And now, in the last section, he says, all of these works you wrote in Sanskrit. But is it impossible to compose poetry in Telugu? Create a great poem in Telugu for my pleasure. And, this line, is it impossible to compose poetry in Telugu, is an interesting one in the sense that there was a period of time, not at this point because we'd seen the evolution of Telugu literature, but there's kind of still a lingering idea that if you want to compose poetry or you want to compose anything literary, then you have to use a language like Sanskrit, a literary language. Telugu is not a language to write stories in. Sometimes I say this in class, for example, like texting. Texting nowadays, everyone's texting, everyone has a different kind of, they write LUV and they write U, the letter U for you. All this kind of stuff is funny. And we think that texting is, it has its kind of own language, but in the future, people will probably write novels in textese. But today we think, oh, no, text language is not a language for literature. But who knows? One day text language could become a language for literature. And this is how, traditions evolve over time and how perceptions about a language can change. So even now at Raya's time, is it impossible to compose? I mean, you've done all this in Sanskrit. Can't you do it in Telugu? He's kind of like giving him that sense that, it's possible, but you haven't done it. So you really should do it. And he wants him to compose this great poem. All right. So here's a map. Vijayanagara is a very multicultural, multilingual world. You have the Bahmani sultans, you have, the Tamil kings in the south, you have, the Gajapatis in the east, Deccan, South India, all mixing together, many languages. And, the kind of distinction between languages that we sometimes feel today, especially post-colonial developments, I think are much less than what we imagine, especially during this period. But in terms of Telugu literature, this was considered a golden age. This was when most people at the Vijayanagara court, the majority of the poets were Telugu poets. There were, of course, Kannada poets, Tamil poets, Sanskrit poets, No problem. All of that was also being supported. But at this particular moment, Telugu seemed to be, at its kind of most ascendant point. So there's this kind of golden age idea. And again, some of these ideas of a golden age and all of this stuff are, post Krishnadevaraya kind of imaginations of what that period was like. So we have to kind of keep in mind that this is also a narrative that grows over time. But what's really interesting about this kind of intersection of cultures, again, comes out perfectly in, Krishnadevaraya himself as a human being and in his text. So, Raya is actually a Tulu, it comes from Tulu Nadu. And of course, he composed in Telugu and in Sanskrit, as we just learned. But generally, he's called King of Karnataka, Kannadaraya. So again, and Vijayanagara technically is in today's Karnataka. But, again, what these distinctions mean in terms of, what is Kannada? What does it refer to? Does it, correspond exactly to the boundaries of what we think of Karnataka today? All of that is questionable. What is most interesting, and I'll delve into this in more detail, and this is really the key point, and the key, distinguishing factor of this text is that up until this point, and as we've seen so far, all Telugu literature was primarily pretty much based on Bharata, Ramayana, or some kind of Purana. Means a Sanskrit source. Basically, stories from the Sanskrit tradition were retold in Telugu. When Raya comes along, he does not choose a story from any of these Puranas or Itihasa. He chooses a Tamil story, and he chooses the story of Andal, one of the Alvar saints, this young, mystic girl. She wasn't even a woman, she was a young girl. And that becomes the core of his story. And again, this is what, really situates Raya within the Sri Vaishnava tradition. And this is really, really important to remember. And I'll go into this a little bit more, and we can get into it in the question and answer. I was just thinking about it when I was, getting ready this morning, is, relating to something that I think Michelle had asked yesterday. You see, the Alvar tradition, we say, of course, is Tamil. They're speaking in Tamil, they're writing in Tamil. But by the time, and on Andal, it's hard to exactly date, but let's say 8th, 9th century, something like 7th, 8th, 9th century, something like that. So quite a number of centuries removed from Raya. But what's important to remember is that between those two, between, let's say Andal's time and Raya's time, the key middle thing is Ramanuja. Ramanuja is the one that really, defines the Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya. And the key contribution, I would say, of Ramanuja is giving that old Tamil Alvar tradition a highly Sanskritized framework. And so by the time that this Alvar tradition reaches Raya, it's already been influenced heavily by a Sanskritic kind of, philosophical understanding, underpinning of many levels. So this is important to remember, that all of this stuff is constantly in circulation. And, and arguably, even if we go back to the Alvars themselves, remember, Andal is not writing about, Tamil gods or goddesses. She's writing about Krishna. So even the development of, the Alvars represents an infusion of Sanskrit kind of, themes into, you could say, a Tamil poetic sensibility. So just to summarize what I'm really getting at is that all these distinctions of Tamil, Sanskrit, Karnataka, Andhra, it's very complicated. It's all mixed up, and it's good and important for us to not, draw such sharp lines between all of these things, and actually try to understand how porous things were and how, mutually influential all of them were. Okay, so this Bhuvana Vijayanam that I mentioned, it was supposed to be held up by these 8 elephants, Ashtadig Gajalu, so that, the 8 directions, you have, these elephants, and they're supposed to hold up the entire universe. That's the mythological idea. So in that same way, these 8 elephants at the Bhuvana Vijayam are supposed to hold up the entire universe, but they're poets, each of these great poets, and I've kind of listed them all out. Not that there's actually some debate on exactly who the 8 are, but some of the important ones to remember are, first of all, Peddana. Peddana is kind of considered, well, you'll see at the end there, I wrote, these are the words of Peddana, but he's putting them in Krishnadevaraya's voice. So Peddana was the kind of poet laureate. He was the kind of the great poet, the most beloved poet friend of Krishnadevaraya. And Krishnadevaraya calls him Andhra Kavita Pitamaha. So the grandsire, the grandfather of all Telugu poetry. So Peddana has this really important position, and he's also important historically because we do hear about him in various texts. We do have good cross-referential information between, for example, Manu Charitra and Āmuktamālyada. Another important poet was Timmana. Another one, Durjati, very interesting. Surana, I'll mention in a second. And then, of course, we talked about yesterday briefly Tenali Ramakrishna. But again, please remember, Tenali Ramakrishna here, the one I'm talking about, was really like a brilliant, skilled poet, and probably did have some, witty kind of personality. In Telugu, he's known as Vikata Kavi, which is interesting because it's a palindrome. Vikata Kavi. You go back and forth. So Tenali Ramakrishna probably had a wit to him, but he was not the kind of jester-like, character again. And it's important to keep these two things separate. So anyway, these 8 poets are considered, probably all of them didn't, sit around at the Vijayanagara court. Actually, even historically, they probably don't really match up. But again, this is part of what I'm saying is a post facto imagination of the greatness of the court and what was going on at that time. But we do have, even from the Portuguese sources, references to this exact hall, the Bhuvana Vijayam. And so according to Paes, one of the Portuguese horse merchants, the hall was built when the king returned from the war against Orissa. It was a wide open space with lofty walls covered from top to bottom with crimson and green velvet and other handsome clothes. So that's nice that we get that reference. In Manu Charitram by Peddana, we get a direct reference to the word Bhuvana Vijayam. Seated on the lion throne in the hall known as World Conquest, among the company of wise scholars, he was struck by the sweetness of poetry, that he is Krishnadevaraya. And the context here is that while Raya was sitting in the Bhuvana Vijayam, he was just, blown away by how beautiful everything was. And this is the opportunity at which he requests Peddana to compose his great Mahakavya, the Manu Charitram. So that's a little context. Okay, so it was interesting, the other day, I was listening to or reading about Mana's presentation about this word Prabandha. Now, what's interesting in the Telugu context, Prabandha pretty much means Mahakavya. Or great poem. What we would consider in the Sanskrit tradition as Mahakavya basically becomes like Prabandha in Telugu. Now, what's interesting, and I kind of mentioned this yesterday, I didn't get into details, the general modality of Telugu literature, particularly within these Prabandha genres, was Champu. Now, Champu represents a form where you have both Padya and Gadya. So you have verse and prose together, and that was an interesting kind of mix of the two styles that came together, and it became the general modality of Telugu poetry. And this was in contrast, of course, to some of the stuff like I had mentioned, Somanatha writing in Dwipada. So there you would get no Gadya. But anyway, the point here is that Prabandha was the dominant kind of what we would call Mahakavya style of Telugu. And here I've just listed out the 6 main chapters in Āmuktamālyada and what's going on in each part. So very quickly, I'll go through it. The point really to remember is a Mahakavya starts with a little kernel of something, a little story. And most of the kavya is not about that little story. Most of the kavya, or that little story, is just a pretext for the Mahakavya to discuss, mountains and kings and war and lovemaking and sunsets and, all these things. And, if you look at, who is Dundan or any of the old theoreticians, they'll list out, the 18 or the whatever number of things that every Mahakavya must have. And so even in this case, even though the story is about Andal, Āmuktamālyada does mean Andal. Āmuktamālyada, by the way, means it's basically a Sanskrit / Teluguization of the Tamil Chudu Kurita Nachyar, the girl who gave the garland away. So Āmukta is, taking off basically, and or Āmukta is already worn. Da is the giving of it, and the Malya is the garland. So if you know Andal's story, the story is that she used to, her father, Periyalvar, who's actually a main character even in Āmuktamālyada, was a garland maker, and he would make these garlands for, the local Vishnu temple, and then tell Andal to go and bring them to Vishnu. And so Andal would do that, but she was always kind of in love with Vishnu, and so she would put on these garlands and kind of pretend like these were like the wedding garlands that she would have married to her, beloved, and then she would, take them off and then give them to God. And of course, Periyalvar, Vishnu Chitta, found out about this and got really upset. And then, of course, Vishnu comes to him and says, no. Those are the only garlands I want. I love her. Don't worry. It's fine. And bring her to me. And of course, that's when she reaches, her true kind of ascension into heaven, which is the end of the story. But anyway, getting back to the point is that a Mahakavya or a Prabandha takes a core story as a pretext to tell all sorts of other things. So for example, in chapter 1, we get a huge, beautiful description of Sri Viliputturu, which is the home of Andal and Periyalvar, and a long description about Vishnu Chitta, that's Periyalvar or Andal's father. Next, in chapter 2, we get a description of Madura. We get a description of a great Pandya king. We have a huge section on summer. And it's really important in Mahakavyas to have verses on every season. And the summer section particularly is considered one of the finest in this work. So I'll read some verses from that in a little while. Chapter 2 also introduces this idea that the king is having a dilemma about which philosophy to follow. And so he has this big context. He brings all these people together, Vedantins and Sankhya and Yoga and everybody. And then Vishnu Chitta goes there and he wins the debate and kind of proves the great supremacy of Sri Vaishnavism. Then there's a couple very interesting passages which I did not translate in the book. They're highly philosophical from the Vishnu Purana that get into, avidya, as you can see, in this story of Kandikya and Keshidwaja. This is from the Vishnu Purana. Again, showing Raya's familiarity with some pretty arcane information from the Sri Vaishnava tradition. In chapter 4, we have some beautiful verses about Vishnu Chitta's victory at this debate, the procession, Dashavatara Stotram. And then there's a whole section that tells the story of Yamunacharya. So Yamunacharya was, kind of like the teacher of Ramanuja. So he falls in the Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya at some level. And so you have a whole section about that. Then there's a description of monsoon, the description of autumn. Again, Yamunacharya and his relation to Ranganatha or Sri Rangam, which we'll get to in a second. And then in chapter 4, there's a whole section on Rajadharma or Rajaniti. And this is one of the most fascinating sections of the text. I mean, Raya has about 80 verses about how to be a great king embedded in this Mahakavya. And, in my other work, you can read and look at, I cross-reference a lot of those poems with the historical information. And it's very clear that, this was not, as I say, straight up kind of Arthashastra type of, imitation, but a very kind of updated, lived, reflection of his political ideas. So finally, in chapter 5, we get to Goda and the birth of Goda, Goda's beauty, and the way that Raya is able to describe, with such tenderness and deft, the kind of, beauty of a young woman is really fascinating. You learn about Goda's friends. There's a whole section that I think that is very much like the Tirupave in Tamil, kind of recast into a Telugu setting. Then there's a whole section on spring. There's a whole section on, Viraha. And then finally in chapter 6, actually, the beginning of chapter 6 is really interesting. There's a whole sub-story called the Maladasari Kada and the Somasarma Kada, which is basically about a Brahmin Rakshasa who wants to eat this untouchable devotee, and how this untouchable devotee, basically gives salvation to this Brahmin Rakshasa. It's a very interesting story. I published that in another journal. It's not in the book, but you can read that whole story. It's fascinating. And by the way, just as a side note, that story contains within it the longest Sanskrit compound ever used. And it's a beautiful verse that describes a huge banyan tree. So Raya uses almost, the whole verse as one samasa to describe this banyan tree. Very interesting. But again, all of these stories are coming and going. And then after that story, we finally get to a description of Srirangam, a description of Ranganatha, and then Andal's basically, marriage to Ranganatha, and that's the end. So this world of a Mahakavya is vast, it's huge, and it's beautiful. Okay. Now, on the issue of Sri Vaishnavism, I just want to, the Avataraka Padyam of any text, that's the first poem, the Avataraka, the one that brings you into it, that brings you down into the text. Very important. And the one, Raya's first one, Sri Kamaniya Haramani Chennuga, that verse is such a powerful, beautiful verse. And of course, it's dedicated to Venkateshwara, who is his Ishtadevata. And I'll just read it out because it's a beautiful idea of this kind of idea of, a reflected kind of imagination that, what is in you is outside, and what is outside becomes the inside. So, he is seen in the sparkle of her lovely jeweled necklace, and she is reflected in his radiant Kaustubha gem, as if the image of the other that each held within their hearts was coming into view, their bodies merging crystal pure into a single being. To this magnificent Lord of Venkata, I offer my salutations. Fantastic, image there, So the idea is that Vishnu and Lakshmi are facing each other, and that the image, they hold of each other, they love each other. So that image is what's coming to the surface, but that inner reality is reflected in these jewels that they're wearing. And then through that, they find a union. This invocation then moves into a number of verses on different, what we call Amsha Avataras. And all of these Amsha Avataras relate to the Alvar. So each Alvar is also related to some Amsha of Vishnu. And in verse 10 of the introduction, he literally, makes reference to the Alvars. So his verse there is, to escape the intense heat of the 12 Aditya sons, Vishnu resides in the cool, loving hearts of the 12 Alvar saints, intoxicated by the sweet cascades of nectar that fill their lotus minds. In my search for salvation, I honor these luminous bodies, 12 blessed souls of the earth. So, he's right in there in this tradition. Okay. Again, as I was saying, a lot of, the Sri Vaishnavism, or the Alvar tradition, you could say, that, Raya is getting exposed to, is filtered through the work of Ramanuja, and as I'm saying, a certain kind of, you could say, Sanskritization of that Tamil tradition. So, for example, he's always quoting different kinds of, text, and even in when Vishnu Chitta is debating in the court, he uses a number of references, and I'll just read those out. And if you want to know more about these specific references, which he does give in the text, you can check out the notes. In this way, Vishnu Chitta used Dvaipayana's Brahma Sutras and the authoritative Vedas to prove beyond any doubt that God is the everlasting bliss of consciousness. He was praised by all the scholars and went on to teach that God Vishnu was different from all other gods, clearly establishing with irrefutable proofs the absolute preeminence of Vishishta Advaita. So it's quite fascinating, the levels of interaction that happen throughout all of these traditions. And of course, Raya is adding his own level of interpretation and integration. I think I mentioned all of these other things before. The Vishnu Purana mentioned, Yamunacharya, and then of course Venkateswara Tirupati, a site of very important bhakti devotion, and also a really important center for the development of Sri Vaishnava thought in general. Okay, so I just wanted to read a couple more verses again of, this is towards the end of the text, the kind of devotional outpouring and love and reverence for Ranganatha and the particular forms that he, at least in Raya's eye, embodies. So God beyond gods, you are Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. For the entire universe, you are the force of creation, existence, and dissolution. I worship only you, Narayana, the great light, the everlasting home of all beings. You are the supreme being beyond both man and God. You are the highest soul, constantly meditated upon by assemblies of yogis in search of salvation. You pervade every part of the natural world, and yet you cannot be classified by the three qualifying colors. You are imperceptible to the power of the collective senses, existing as purity without a mark. You are the source of the primal elements, stainless, pure, and all-pervading. From hours to minutes to the blink of an eye, you are the passage of the thread of time. O Vishnu, Narayana, the greatest God, I am led to service when I imagine you. It's really very powerful, very beautiful. And here, this is an example from the description of Andal. It's a beautiful whole section there, but I just the gentleness and this basically Andal's pubescence and her coming into womanhood and what that means is quite beautiful. So this is one of my favorite verses. As her beauty matured, she watched the world with half-open eyes. She grew quiet, reserved. Her eyebrows darkened, and she frowned at playing with childish dolls. The palms of her hand and the soles of her feet turned beautifully pink, and her hair grew long and curly. Her waist became thin, and her breasts grew full, pushing away her childhood. And though the others didn't notice these changes, she grew aware of her body. And in this way, day by day, her childhood slipped away. Really, really gorgeous. That whole section is really beautiful. All right, so in the interest of time, I'll just quickly go through a couple more. Like I mentioned, the Rajaniti section is fascinating, and I've talked about this in many places. I just thought I'd highlight a couple verses where Raya talks about the forest tribes. And it's very interesting, the kind of relationship that a king had with, these groups, because, well, here's what he has to say. When tribals offer rice pudding as a token of truth, they will never go back on their word. Do not become angry when you notice small faults in their behavior. Do not take this as a light matter, for the forest tribes are great of heart. So, his perception of difference and yet accommodation, I think, is quite interesting. Finding the faults of forest tribes who live in the lower highlands of the empire is like trying to wash a mud wall. Subdue them with kind words and gifts, for they will never bend to anger. Turn them into a shield and use them to plunder your bordering enemies. For one who rules an empire, there's no need to ponder 1,000 punishments for 100 crimes. So these are the kinds of things that Raya was writing, and really, I feel like putting into practice as a, as a king of the early 16th century. There's a lot more to discuss about all this, but let me just share a couple more verses and then we can have discussion. As I mentioned, you have to have seasonal descriptions in all kavya. And when I say seasonal descriptions, it's not like a couple verses. There will be like 40 verses on summer. There will be 60 verses on, Varshakala, the rainy season. There'll be, 80 verses on whatever, the cold season. So like that, those are significant areas, but they're just opportunities for the poet to express and show off their kind of poetic imagination. So here are a couple ones that I like a lot. I like this one, the first one, because I translated around for pancake, but basically we're talking about dosas here, and that's important. Attu, some kind of attu he's making. So the earth dries out from the sizzling heat, and hot steam rises as water evaporates. The cool night moonlight is absorbed into the ground as if groups of white nightingales were pouring a round flat dosa on a steaming hot griddle. This is a beautiful image. And then here's one of my favorite ones because it has a food recipe, and Raya clearly was, a foodie. There's no doubt about that. And I'll share a couple verses to end about his foodiness. But on a summer afternoon, expert Epicureans season sun-ripened mangoes in sizzling hot oil and saute fresh cuts of fish taken from dried out ponds. And at sunset, when they burp from the spice, they stroll to shady groves where they've buried coconuts in the sand and ease their tummies with refreshing juice. I just love that image that, they know that they're going to be burping from their like spicy lunch. So, they've pre-buried these coconuts so they'll be nice and ready for them when they want them after their nap. It's really a beautiful little verse. And here's a couple more seasonal menus. And this is actually in regard when Raya in the beginning describes Viliputtur and how Vishnuchitta and his wife are constantly, serving food to pilgrims. And, here's a perfect example. I always use this verse because, we've talked about, the landscape of India and what that really represents. And he's talking about the snow mountains, Himalayas, all the way to, the Sandalwood Hills, that's, Malayas, let's say in the south. So there's that idea of an India that's, the Himalayas up top and then all the way down to the bottom as all part of one kind of world, and with shared cultural ideas. So with his hard-earned savings, that great yogi served food to all the groups of visiting Vaishnavas who came and went along the road that stretches from the northern snow mountains to the southern Sandalwood Hills. During the rain-drenched days when the sky was like a bubbling spring, Vishnuchitta's wife would expertly prepare a fire using dried coconut husks, never allowing the smoke to touch her eyes. She would cook the food and he would lovingly serve it, all with a coconut shell ladle. Fine rice soaked in ghee served with peeled red lentils, 4 or 5 well-seasoned curries, crispy black lentil chips, dried vegetable stir-fries, and yogurt. And he goes on to give a number of other menus based on season. So it's a lovely little section there. Okay, that's it. Good. I'm almost out of time. So thank you all. I will stop sharing and love to have some questions. I'm sorry I went fast, but I wanted to give you a sense of the vastness of what these texts are and what they include and the kinds of ideas that they're thinking about. Okay, thank you.